There's a kind of silence that most people don't notice, the kind that doesn't come from an empty room, but from a full life that somehow still feels emotionally distant. It's the silence of someone who understands people deeply, yet rarely feels understood in return. If you've ever looked around and wondered why your circle is so small or almost non-existent while everyone else seems surrounded by noise, laughter, and constant connection, this might hit closer than you expect. Because the truth is, having few or no friends isn't always about being unlucky, awkward, or distant. Sometimes it's the result of seeing too much, feeling too deeply, and carrying a level of emotional awareness that quietly separates you from the crowd. And that separation doesn't always feel empowering at first. Sometimes it feels confusing, isolating, even painful. But what if that space you're in right now isn't a flaw, but a pattern? A pattern shared by people who experience the world in a completely different way. People who don't just exist in conversations, but feel the weight behind every word, every pause, every unspoken emotion. And if that's you, then what you're about to hear might not just explain your reality, it might finally make sense of it. Because one of the biggest reasons empaths end up with very few friends is simple yet heavy. They don't just feel emotions, they absorb them. Imagine walking into a room and instantly picking up on tension that no one else is acknowledging, sensing discomfort behind forced smiles, or feeling the emotional state of someone without them saying a single word. That's not imagination. That's your everyday baseline. And over time, that kind of awareness stops being a gift and starts becoming overwhelming. While others can move through conversations lightly, you're processing layers beneath the surface. You're not just hearing words. You're interpreting energy, tone, intention. And that constant processing, it drains you. It makes socializing feel less like something fun and more like something you have to mentally prepare for. So naturally, you start limiting your interactions. Not because you don't care, but because you care too much, and it costs you more than it costs others. And then comes something even more isolating: small talk. The thing most social environments are built on feels almost unbearable to you. Talking about random surface-level things, pretending to be interested in conversations that don't go anywhere, smiling through interactions that feel empty, it's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain. You don't hate people, you just crave something real, something meaningful, something that actually connects. But the world doesn't always operate on that level. Most people are comfortable staying on the surface, keeping things light, avoiding depth, and when you try to go deeper, it either makes others uncomfortable or they simply don't meet you there. So what happens? You start pulling back. Not dramatically, not in a way that others would even notice at first, but slowly, quietly, you disengage. You stop forcing conversations that don't feel right. You stop entertaining connections that feel empty, and before you realize it, your circle shrinks. Not because you pushed people away, but because you stop pretending. And here's where it gets even more complicated, because as you grow emotionally, you begin to outgrow people without even trying to. It's not intentional. You don't wake up one day deciding to leave people behind. It just happens. The things that once felt normal start to feel misaligned. The conversations that once felt enough start to feel shallow. The connections that once felt close start to feel distant. And it creates this strange kind of loneliness. Not because you don't have people, but because the people you have no longer feel like they truly see you. And that realization is heavy, because it forces you to choose between staying in connections that no longer feel right or walking away into uncertainty, into solitude, into a space where you don't know who will replace them or if anyone will. And more often than not, empaths choose the second option, not because it's easier, but because it's honest. But maybe the deepest reason behind all of this is something that builds over time. Being misunderstood, not once or twice, but repeatedly. Being told you're too sensitive, too intense, too emotional. Being made to feel like your depth is a problem instead of a perspective. At first, you try to adjust. You try to tone it down, to fit in, to meet people where they are, but eventually something shifts. You get tired. Not angry, just tired. Tired of explaining yourself. Tired of feeling like you have to shrink parts of who you are just to be accepted. And that's when the distance really begins. Because once you reach that point, you stop trying to be understood by everyone. You become more selective, more quiet, more guarded. And from the outside, it might look like you're becoming distant or disconnected, but on the inside, you're simply choosing peace over constant misalignment. And then there's one trait that almost guarantees a smaller circle. You can sense what others try to hide. Fake energy doesn't pass unnoticed. Forced kindness feels off. Words that don't match actions stand out instantly. And while others might overlook these things or ignore them, you can't. It creates this internal conflict where you want to believe people, but your intuition keeps picking up signals that something isn't right. And over time, that makes trust harder. Not impossible, but heavier. You start questioning connections more deeply. You start observing instead of diving in. And because of that, you don't attach easily. You don't open up quickly. You don't let people in just because they're there. And while that protects you, it also means fewer people ever make it past your walls. But here's the part most people don't understand. None of this means you don't want connection. You do, probably more than most. But you want the kind that feels real, the kind that doesn't require you to filter yourself, to dim your awareness, to ignore your instincts. And that kind of connection, it's rare. So instead of surrounding yourself with noise, you choose quiet. Instead of filling your life with people who don't truly align, you stay alone until something genuine comes along. And yes, that can feel isolating at times. It can feel like you're missing out, like you're watching life from the outside. But deep down, there's also a sense of knowing that forcing connections just to avoid loneliness would cost you something even more important, your authenticity. So if you've ever felt like you don't quite fit into the way most people connect, if you've ever questioned why your circle is so small while your awareness feels so big, understand this. It's not random. It's not accidental. It's a reflection of how deeply you experience the world. And while that path can feel lonely at times, it's also the same path that leads to the most meaningful, rare, and real connections you'll ever have. And somewhere along that journey, after the exhaustion, after the misunderstandings, after the quiet distancing, you start to build something that changes everything. Boundaries. Not the kind you learned early in life, because if you're like most people who feel deeply, boundaries probably came late. At first, you gave freely, without filters, without limits. You listened longer than you should have, stayed when you should have walked away, poured energy into people who barely noticed it. And for a while, you believed that was kindness, that was love, that was connection. But over time, the pattern revealed itself. You weren't just giving, you were being drained. Slowly, silently, piece by piece. And something inside you eventually said, enough. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift. You began to say no even when it felt uncomfortable. You started stepping back even when guilt tried to pull you forward. And the strange part, the moment you built those boundaries, some people disappeared. Not because you changed into someone cold, but because you stopped being someone easy to take from. And that realization stays with you. It teaches you that not everyone was there for you. Some were there for what you provided. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. That's when solitude starts to feel different. It's no longer just something you fall into, it becomes something you choose. Because being alone, as quiet as it is, feels safer than being surrounded by people who slowly drain you. There's a peace in not having to read between the lines, not having to manage someone else's emotional weight, not having to question intentions or decode mixed signals. When you're alone, your energy stays yours. Your mind slows down, your emotions settle, and for someone who has spent so long absorbing everything around them, that peace isn't empty, it's healing. But this is where it gets misunderstood from the outside. People see your distance and assume you've become antisocial, closed off, disconnected. They don't see the internal shift. They don't understand that you're not avoiding people, you're avoiding exhaustion. You're protecting something that took you years to recognize. And yes, sometimes it gets lonely, sometimes the silence stretches longer than you'd like, but even then, there's a part of you that knows this is still better than feeling alone in a room full of people who don't truly see you. And then there's the part that hurts in a quieter way, the imbalance. Because when you do connect, you don't do it halfway, you give deeply, you listen fully, you show up in ways that most people don't. You remember the small things, you notice the unspoken feelings, you offer support without being asked. And for you, that's natural. It's not something you calculate or keep track of, but over time you begin to notice something. That same depth isn't always returned. Conversations feel one-sided. Effort feels uneven. You're the one reaching out, checking in, holding space, while the other person simply receives. And at first you make excuses. You tell yourself they're busy, they're going through something, they just express things differently. But the pattern repeats, and eventually it becomes impossible to ignore. You start to feel the weight of giving without receiving, of caring without being cared for in the same way. And that realization doesn't just hurt, it changes you. It makes you pause before giving. It makes you question before investing. Not because you've become less kind, but because you've learned that your energy has value. And not everyone knows how to honor it. What makes it even more intense is how much you notice. Things that others overlook completely don't escape you. A slight change in tone, a delayed response, a shift in energy, these aren't small details to you, they're signals. And your mind doesn't just register them, it tries to understand them. Why did they say it like that? Why did their energy feel different today? Are they being genuine or is something off? And while others move through interactions without thinking twice, you're processing layers beneath the surface. It's like living in a constant state of awareness that never fully turns off. And over time, that level of perception becomes exhausting because you're not just experiencing your own emotions, you're navigating everyone else's as well. It turns simple interactions into complex emotional landscapes. And after a while, you start choosing your interactions more carefully. Not because you want to overthink, but because your mind doesn't give you the option not to. And then comes something many people don't talk about openly: emotional burnout. Not the kind that shows up dramatically, but the kind that builds quietly over time. It's the result of caring too much for too long without enough balance. It's waking up feeling mentally tired before the day even begins. It's losing the energy to engage even with people you care about. It's wanting connection, but not having the emotional capacity to handle it. And the hardest part? Most people don't see it. Because from the outside, it doesn't look like burnout. It looks like distance. It looks like you've become quieter, less responsive, less involved. But inside, it's not about not caring. It's about having nothing left to give. And when you reach that point, something shifts again. You start protecting your energy even more. You become more selective, more intentional, more aware of where your time and emotions go. Because you've felt what it's like to be completely drained, and you don't want to go back there. And this is where your approach to people changes in a subtle but powerful way. You stop chasing. Not because you don't value connection, but because you've learned that real connection doesn't need to be forced. Instead of constantly reaching out, trying to maintain relationships, trying to prove your presence, you step back. You observe. You watch who makes the effort without being asked, who checks in without a reason, who shows up without needing something in return. And what you notice can be both eye-opening and painful, because when you stop chasing, a lot of people stop showing up. And that silence reveals more than words ever could. It shows you who was there out of convenience and who is there out of genuine connection. And while that realization can shrink your circle even further, it also refines it. It filters out the noise and leaves space for something real, even if that space stays empty for a while. But despite all of this, despite the solitude, the boundaries, the awareness, the exhaustion, there's something important happening beneath the surface. You're learning, not just about others, but about yourself. You're understanding what drains you, what fulfills you, what aligns with you, and what doesn't. You're becoming more intentional with your energy, more honest with your needs, more aware of your limits, and that growth, as quiet as it is powerful, because it's shaping the kind of life you're building. One that isn't based on fitting in, but on being real. And yes, that path can feel lonely at times. It can feel like you're walking it without much company. But what you're creating is something most people spend their entire lives searching for: authenticity, peace, and connections that actually mean something. So if your circle feels small right now, if your world feels quieter than it used to, it doesn't mean you're losing something. It might mean you're refining it. It might mean you're stepping out of spaces that were never meant for you and making room for ones that are. And that process, it's not loud. It's not instant. But it's real. And in the long run, it's what leads you to the kind of connections that don't drain you, don't confuse you, don't make you question your worth, but instead feel like home. And as you keep moving forward with that awareness, something inside you becomes sharper, almost like a quiet instinct that never switches off. You begin to realize that not everyone deserves access to you. Not your time, not your energy, not your thoughts, and definitely not your emotional depth. This isn't something you learned overnight. It came from experience, from giving too much to the wrong people, from trusting too easily, from opening up only to feel misunderstood or overlooked. And slowly you started to understand something that most people never fully grasp. Access to you is a privilege, not a right. So you begin to pull back, not in a defensive way, but in a conscious one. You stop explaining yourself to people who never tried to understand you in the first place. You stop overextending your kindness where it isn't appreciated, and instead you become more intentional. You watch more than you speak, you listen more than you reveal. And while this makes your circle smaller, it also makes it stronger, because the few who remain are the ones who truly see you, not just benefit from you. But here's where the pattern gets even deeper, because despite all this awareness, you still find yourself attracting the same kind of people. People who are hurting, broken, emotionally overwhelmed. It's almost like they can sense something in you, a kind of safety, a kind of understanding that they don't find elsewhere. And without even trying, you become their space, their listener, their emotional support. And for a while it feels meaningful. It feels like you're making a difference, like you're helping someone heal. But over time, the pattern reveals its cost. Because while you're pouring into them, holding space for their pain, helping them process their emotions, there's often no one doing the same for you. And when they finally feel better, when they no longer need that support, they slowly fade. Not always intentionally, not always in a cruel way, but it happens. And you're left in the same place again, empty, drained, alone. And that's when it hits you. Not everyone who comes into your life is meant to stay. Some come to take, to heal, to grow, and then leave. And while that realization can feel heavy, it also brings clarity. It teaches you to recognize patterns, to protect your energy, and to stop confusing being needed with being valued. And because of everything you've been through, everything you've seen and felt, you start becoming more selective. Not antisocial, not distant, but intentional. There's a difference, and it's important. You're not avoiding people because you don't like them. You're choosing carefully because you understand yourself. You know what drains you know what feels forced, you know what doesn't align with who you are anymore. So instead of saying yes to every invitation, every conversation, every connection, you pause. You ask yourself, does this feel right? Does this bring peace? Or does it bring pressure? And if it doesn't align, you let it go quietly, without explanation, without guilt. And while others might not understand that choice, you do, because you've learned that protecting your energy isn't selfish, it's necessary. And once you reach that level of awareness, it becomes almost impossible to go back to how things used to be. This is also where your priorities shift in a way that most people don't expect. You stop caring about how many people are in your life and start caring about how real those connections are. Quantity loses its value. Depth becomes everything. You'd rather have one conversation that feels genuine, meaningful, and honest than 10 that feel empty and surface level. You'd rather sit in silence with someone who understands you than laugh with people who don't truly know you. And that shift, it changes everything, because it removes the pressure to constantly be social, to constantly be connected, to constantly be surrounded by people just for the sake of it. Instead, you become comfortable with less, because you know that less, when it's real, is more than enough. And that mindset, while it may look isolating from the outside, is actually incredibly freeing from the inside. And in that space of fewer distractions, fewer forced interactions, fewer emotional demands, you start turning inward. Not in a way that disconnects you from the world, but in a way that reconnects you with yourself. You begin to understand your own thoughts more clearly, your own emotions more deeply. You reflect on your patterns, your experiences, your reactions. You start asking yourself questions you never had the time or space to ask before. Why do certain things affect me the way they do? What do I truly need from people? What kind of life actually feels right for me? And through that process, something powerful happens. You begin to know yourself, not just on the surface, but on a level that most people never reach. And that self-awareness becomes your foundation. It guides your decisions, your boundaries, your connections. It helps you move through life with more clarity, more intention, more honesty. And while that journey can feel lonely at times, it's also where your strength comes from. And then there's something that becomes almost impossible to ignore once you've reached this level of awareness. You start seeing through people. Not in a judgmental way, not in a harsh way, but in a clear way. You notice the masks people wear, the roles they play, the personas they present to the world. You can tell when someone is being genuine and when they're performing. You can feel when someone's words don't match their energy. And while this ability protects you, it also creates distance. Because once you see through the surface, it becomes harder to engage with it. You can't pretend not to notice. You can't go back to taking things at face value. And that makes certain environments, certain conversations, certain relationships feel off. Not necessarily wrong, just misaligned. And over time, you start stepping away from those spaces, not with anger, not with resentment, but with quiet understanding, because you know that forcing yourself to stay in places that don't feel real will only disconnect you further from yourself. And through all of this, something subtle but powerful continues to grow inside you, a kind of comfort in walking alone. Not because you've given up on connection, not because you don't care anymore, but because you've found something within yourself that doesn't rely on others to feel complete. The silence that once felt heavy starts to feel peaceful. The solitude that once felt isolating starts to feel grounding. You begin to enjoy your own company, your own thoughts, your own presence. And that shift, it changes everything. Because now being alone isn't something you fear, it's something you understand. It's something you choose when the alternative doesn't align. And that doesn't mean you'll always be alone. It just means you're no longer willing to settle for connections that don't match your depth. So if you've made it this far in your journey, if you've felt the distance, the quiet, the shift in how you connect with people, understand this: you're not losing your ability to connect. You're refining it. You're becoming more aware of what truly matters, more intentional with who you allow into your life, more aligned with who you are at your core. And yes, that path can feel different from what you see around you. It can feel slower, quieter, even lonelier at times. But it's also more real, more grounded, more honest. And in the long run, that's what leads you to the kind of connections that don't just fill space, but actually mean something. And at some point on this path, something clicks in a way that's hard to explain but impossible to ignore. You realize that walking alone doesn't mean you're lost. It means you've stopped following the crowd blindly. There's a difference, a big one. Because most people spend their lives trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for them, forcing connections that don't feel right, adjusting their personality just to maintain a sense of belonging. But you stepped out of that pattern, not loudly, not rebelliously, but consciously. You started choosing alignment over approval, peace over popularity. And while that decision came with distance, it also came with clarity. You no longer feel the need to explain why certain environments drain you or why certain conversations feel empty. You just know. And that knowing becomes your compass. It guides you away from what doesn't resonate and quietly pulls you toward what does, even if that path looks quieter than everyone else's. But here's something deeper that starts to unfold as you grow into this version of yourself. You begin to understand that your solitude was never just about other people. It was also about meeting parts of yourself you had ignored for too long. When you're constantly surrounded by noise, by conversations, by external energy, it's easy to lose touch with your own inner voice. But in the silence, in the stillness, that voice gets louder, clearer. You start noticing your own patterns, your own wounds, your own unspoken needs. And it's not always comfortable. Sometimes it brings up things you avoided for years. Old emotions, unresolved feelings, questions you didn't have answers to, but instead of running from them like you might have in the past, you sit with them. You process them. You understand them. And that process, as heavy as it can feel, is also what heals you. Because for the first time, you're not just feeling others, you're finally feeling yourself. And as that self-awareness deepens, something else naturally begins to shift. Your standards. Not just in relationships, but in everything. The way people speak to you, the way they treat you, the energy they bring into your space. It all starts to matter more. You're no longer willing to overlook disrespect just to keep peace. You're no longer willing to entertain inconsistency just to avoid being alone. You've felt what misalignment cost you, and you're not willing to pay that price again. So your standards rise, not out of ego, not out of superiority, but out of self-respect. And this is where many people misunderstand you. They think you've become too distant, too selective, too hard to reach. But the truth is, you've just become clear. Clear about what you deserve, clear about what you won't tolerate, clear about the kind of energy you're willing to allow into your life. And clarity like that naturally filters people out. Not because you're pushing them away, but because not everyone aligns with that level of awareness. And even though your world might feel smaller now, there's something quietly powerful about it. It's real. There's no pretending, no forced connections, no conversations that leave you feeling empty. Everything that remains has meaning, even if it's just your relationship with yourself. And that's something most people never truly build. They rely so heavily on external validation, external connection, external noise, that they never learn how to sit with themselves in peace. But you have. You've learned how to be okay in your own presence. You've learned how to find comfort in your own thoughts. And that kind of independence, it's rare. It's the kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. But let's be real for a moment. Even with all this growth, all this clarity, all this inner strength, there are still moments when it feels heavy. Moments when you question everything. When you wonder if maybe it would be easier to just lower your standards, to just go along with things, to just accept connections that don't fully align. Because being alone, even when it's peaceful, can sometimes feel like you're missing something. Like there's a gap that hasn't been filled yet. And those moments are real. They matter. They don't make you weak, they make you human. Because no matter how strong you become, a part of you will always crave connection, real connection, deep connection, the kind that doesn't make you question yourself or shrink who you are. And the fact that you still hold on to that desire, that's not a flaw. That's proof that your heart is still open, even after everything. And this is where the truth becomes important. You're not meant to stay alone forever. Your journey isn't about isolation, it's about alignment. It's about becoming so clear on who you are, what you feel, and what you need that when the right people do come into your life, you recognize them instantly. You don't second guess it, you don't overanalyze it. It just feels right. Calm, natural, effortless, not perfect, but real. And because you've spent so much time understanding yourself, you're finally able to connect with others in a way that's balanced, healthy, and mutual. No more overgiving, no more one-sided dynamics, no more confusion about where you stand. Just connection that feels steady and genuine. And when that kind of connection shows up, it doesn't overwhelm your peace. It adds to it. It doesn't drain your energy. It respects it. It doesn't make you question your worth. It reflects it. And suddenly, all those moments of solitude, all those times you felt like you were walking alone, start to make sense. Because they weren't empty. They were preparing you. Preparing you to recognize what's real. Preparing you to value what's rare. Preparing you to build something that isn't based on convenience, but on truth. So if you're in that space right now where your circle feels small, where your world feels quieter than it used to, where connection feels rare, don't rush out of it. Don't force your way into spaces that don't feel right just to escape the silence. Because this phase, it's not a setback, it's a transition. It's where you shed everything that doesn't align so you can finally step into something that does. And yes, it takes time. More time than most people are comfortable with. But what you gain from it, clarity, peace, self-awareness, real connection, is worth every moment. Because at the end of all of this, there's one truth that stays constant. You were never too much. You were never too sensitive. You were never too different. You just experienced the world in a deeper way than most people are used to. And that depth, it was never meant to fit into every space or connect with every person. It was meant to be rare, to be intentional, to be real. And that's why your circle is small. Not because you're lacking something, but because you've finally stopped settling for anything less than what truly feels like home.